Nobody cries in the palace. That's not a rule they write down anywhere. No memo, no official decree stamped with the royal seal. But after 31 years of service, head guard Thomas Aldwick knew it the way he knew the angle of every shadow in every corridor. It was simply understood. You swallowed what hurt you. You stood straight. You let the gilded walls witness your composure and nothing else. So when he heard it, that sound, thin and high, slipping under the door of the east sitting room like something trying to escape, his body stopped before his mind did. He'd been making his evening round. 9:47 p.m. The long corridor was empty, the way it always was at this hour. All polished floors and ancestral portraits watching you with their painted indifference. His footsteps had been the only sound for 20 minutes. And then? That. But Thomas stood outside the east sitting room door and did not move. The protocol was clear. A closed door was a closed door. Royal privacy was not a suggestion. He'd turned away from worse. Raised voices, broken things, silences so thick they had texture. That was the job. You heard nothing. You saw nothing. You certainly felt nothing. He put his hand on the door handle anyway. Princess Charlotte was 11 years old, and she was sitting on the floor. Not on the settee. Not in one of the silk-upholstered chairs arranged around the fireplace like a conversation frozen mid-sentence. On the floor, back against the far wall, knees pulled up, in the yellow dress she'd worn to the Commonwealth reception 4 hours ago. The reception that everyone had called a triumph. She had her father's eyes. Everyone said that. William's eyes. And the kind that looked like they were already apologizing for whatever they were about to ask of you. Right now, those eyes were swollen nearly shut. Thomas had a daughter. 23 years old now, lived in Bristol, called on Sundays. He knew what it looked like when a child had been crying for a long time. Not the fresh, loud grief of a new wound, but the hollowed-out, waterlogged misery of something that had been going on since before the crying started. "Your Royal Highness." His voice came out softer than protocol permitted. Charlotte looked up. She didn't startle, which meant she'd heard him come in and hadn't cared enough to stop. That, somehow, was the thing that landed heaviest. "I'm fine," she said. 2 words, and both of them were wrong. He should have withdrawn, closed the door, finished his round, filed nothing. And because there was nothing to file, because a closed door was a closed door, and this was none of his business, and royal children cried sometimes just like all children did, and it meant nothing, and... He crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside her. Not protocol. Wildly, spectacularly not protocol. Thomas Aldwick, 31 years of service, head guard of the residential wing, sat down on the Aubusson rug in his full uniform and rested his back against the wall next to an 11-year-old princess and said nothing. Charlotte looked at him like he'd grown a second head. He looked straight ahead at the fireplace. The fire had burned low. Someone had forgotten to tend it. Or no one had been called to tend it, which amounted to the same loneliness. "You're going to get in trouble," Charlotte said. "Probably. You're supposed to be doing your rounds." "I'll do them in a bit." Silence. The fire shifted. Somewhere deep in the building's bones, a clock ticked. "She told my father I was embarrassing," Charlotte said. "At the reception. She leaned over and she said..." Her voice broke on a hinge that hadn't been quite repaired from the last time. "She said I was too loud, that I was drawing attention the wrong way, in front of the Kenyan delegates. She said it like it was nothing, like she was commenting on the weather." Thomas said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing. It was most of the job. "And my father..." Charlotte stopped, swallowed. The fire popped. He didn't say anything. He touched her arm, like she needed comforting. There it was. Not Camilla. Or not only Camilla. The delegates, the criticism, or the public correction in a yellow dress, those were the surface of it. What was really sitting on this floor, in this room, burning low like the unattended fire, was a daughter watching her father choose, and choosing wrong. Thomas had a daughter in Bristol who called on Sundays. "When I was about your age," he said, "my father missed my school play. He said he'd be there. Front row." He paused. He wasn't. Charlotte turned her head to look at him. "Wasn't a king," Thomas continued. "Just a man who worked too much and apologized in the wrong currency. Bought me a bicycle the next day. Couldn't figure out why I didn't want it." "Did you forgive him?" Thomas looked at the dying fire. Eventually. Not soon enough to tell him properly. The room held that for a moment. "I don't want to forgive anyone," Charlotte said. "Not tonight." "That's fair. Is that terrible?" "No," he said. "That's just tonight." She leaned her head sideways and put it against his shoulder, so briefly, so quickly, a sparrow landing and gone. And then she sat up straight again and wiped her face with the back of her hand. He pretended not to notice either thing. The clock somewhere in the palace walls ticked on. Neither of them moved. Camilla had not gone to bed. That was the thing about plans. They required witnesses to complete them, and the evening had not produced the witness she'd needed. The reception had gone well. The image management had been precise. William, to his eternal credit, was a man who understood the architecture of appearances, and she had spent considerable time helping him understand it. The Charlotte situation had been a minor correction. Necessary. Honey, the girl was 11 and she laughed too loudly, and she'd been monopolizing the Kenyan High Commissioner for 20 minutes with a conversation about conservation biology that, whatever its merits, was not the conversation that needed to be happening. Camilla sat at the writing desk in the Cornwall suite and turned a pen over in her fingers. The correction had been necessary. She reviewed this conclusion with the focus of a woman who needed it to remain true. William had been gracious. William was always gracious. Graciousness was his great gift and his great flaw in equal measure, a smoothing over that could, if you weren't careful, smooth over things that needed to stay rough so you could see them. He'd touched her arm. She'd felt him accept the premise of what she'd said, or she'd thought she had. There had been a moment, a second, maybe less, where his eyes had gone somewhere she couldn't follow. She'd redirected. The High Commissioner, the evening, the function. The pen turned. She had not been unkind. She had been accurate. There was a version of kindness that was simply accurate. A course correction delivered with the calm of someone who had the long view, who understood what these events cost and what they produced and what a girl laughing too loudly in a yellow dress could cost in the margin of perception that the family could not afford to surrender. This was what she told herself. The pen stopped turning. The east sitting room was on the floor below. She had passed it on the way back from the reception. The light had been on under the door. She had kept walking. Camilla set the pen down on the writing desk and looked at her hands. 76 years old. The hands of a woman who had survived the unsurvivable, who had come through the other side of the worst public verdict a person could receive and built something lasting from the rubble of it. She had earned every room in this building. She had earned the right to its corrections. She picked the pen back up. Too loud. 2 words. A mild, passing observation. The girl would not even remember it in a week. The pen tapped once against the desk. Camilla was not cruel. She needed that to be true in the same deep way you need certain walls to be load-bearing. Because if they weren't, things fell. She had kept walking. The fire in the Cornwall suite was perfectly tended. Someone had seen to it. The way someone always saw to everything up here. The right temperature, the right light, the right degree of comfortable that comfort required. She had kept walking past the light under the door. The pen tapped again, then stopped. The morning briefing happened at 7, the way it always did, in the narrow office adjacent to the Chief of Staff's quarters, where the day's requirements were distributed with the brisk efficiency of a military operation, which is, in most functional respects, what a royal household was. Thomas delivered his incident report at 7:14, not because he was required to. There had been no incident, technically. A guard sat on a floor with a crying child. You could search the operational manual for the protocol on that and come back empty. He delivered the report because 31 years of service had made certain things reflexive, and honesty was one of them, and he was not built for the alternative. He wrote it in plain language. At 21:47, during evening rounds, I became aware of Princess Charlotte in distress in the East sitting room. I entered and remained with Her Royal Highness for approximately 22 minutes until she indicated she was ready to retire. No incident occurred. I completed my rounds at 22:14. He slid it across the desk to Deputy Chief Morrison. Morrison read it twice. Then he read it a third time with the expression of a man diffusing something. "You sat on the floor," Morrison said. "Yes." "With the princess?" "Yes." Morrison set the report down. He was a careful man, careful the way a person gets when they've spent enough time in proximity to consequence. He looked at Thomas the way you look at a structural element you've just been told might be compromised. "This will go up," Morrison said. I know." "There will be questions about appropriateness." "I know." Morrison folded his hands. "Was it?" Thomas thought about the fire burning low, the Sparrow landing and gone. "I believe so, sir." Morrison looked at the report for a long moment. Then he picked it up and set it in the stack that went upward, which was where it would go regardless, and filed it under noted no further action required, which was the most protection a deputy chief could quietly offer a man whose instincts had been right in a way that couldn't be officially acknowledged. "Finish your rounds on time tonight," Morrison said. "Yes, sir." William found out at breakfast. Not from Morrison's report. That would take until mid-morning to reach the appropriate desk, and even then it would be a line item, a footnote. The kind of thing that surfaced in the weekly summary. He found out because Charlotte came down to breakfast in her riding clothes instead of her school clothes, which meant she planned to skip her Tuesday tutorial, which meant she was either sick or in a mood, and she was not sick. She sat across from him and ate her toast and did not look at him. William watched her not look at him. He was good at mornings, the presentation of them, the competent forward motion of a man who had somewhere to be and the training to get there. He reached for the coffee. He scanned the briefing notes. He performed the easy fluency of a person whose morning was proceeding normally. Charlotte's toast made a very loud sound when she bit it. "Good morning," he tried. "Morning." The toast, the silence, the very deliberate direction of her gaze. Out the window, eyed toward the grounds, anywhere that was not his face. He set the briefing notes down. "Charlotte." She looked at him then, and there was something in it. Not anger, not exactly, something quieter and more architectural than anger, like a room that had been rearranged while he wasn't looking and he couldn't quite identify what had moved. That made him feel 11 years old himself, which was a very particular and unwelcome feeling for a 42-year-old man at his own breakfast table. "I heard what was said to you last night," he said. "At the reception." Charlotte said nothing. She turned her toast over on the plate. "I should have—" He stopped. There was a version of this that was an explanation and a version that was an apology, and they were not the same thing. And he was standing at the fork between them, trying to determine which one he owed her. "I didn't handle it well." "You touched her arm," Charlotte said, very even, very flat. The flatness of something that has run out of the energy required to be jagged. "I know." "You touched her arm like she was the one who needed something." He had no answer to that was also honest, so he didn't give one. Charlotte looked at her toast. William looked at his daughter. Outside, the grounds were gray and very still, the kind of February morning that commits fully to its colorlessness, and somewhere across the garden a crow was making a sound that carried. "The High Commissioner," Charlotte said quietly. "Did you know he has 3 daughters? He was showing me pictures on his phone. His youngest is 9. She's learning to identify birds by their calls." A pause. The toast. "I wasn't being loud. I was being interested." William's chest did something complicated. "I know," he said again. 2 words that were the best he had, and not nearly enough. Charlotte pushed back her chair and stood up. She was still small, still at that age where she was more child than not, where the adult version of her was mostly theoretical. But she stood up with a straightness that was not childlike at all. "I'm going riding," she said. She didn't ask permission, didn't wait for his response. She walked out of the breakfast room in her riding clothes and left him sitting in front of his briefing notes and his coffee and the specific cold weight of a moment he could not go back and handle differently. The crow outside called again. That William put both hands flat on the table. Camilla came to breakfast at 9. The breakfast room had been cleared and reset by then. William was in his first meeting. The staff moved around her with their morning choreography, coffee, the brioche, the fruit plate arranged the way she preferred it. And she sat at the long table in the morning light and opened the papers the way she did every day. She was on the 3rd paper when the housekeeper, Mrs. Lyle, paused beside the sideboard in a way that was not quite serving and not quite leaving. Camilla looked up. Mrs. Lyle had been with the household for 19 years. She had the face of a woman who had seen a great many things, and the discipline never to mention any of them. She was mentioning something now, without words, with nothing but a particular stillness and a direction of gaze, not at Camilla, not exactly, but adjacent. The way you look at something you're not looking at. "Was there something, Mrs. Lyle?" "The princess had her breakfast early, ma'am. She's gone riding." "I see." A pause, the kind with weight. "She was up very late, I understand," Mrs. Lyle said. "The East sitting room." Camilla set the paper down. Mrs. Lyle still wasn't quite looking at her. She was looking at the sideboard, at the brioche, at the very fine quality of the morning light falling through the windows, at everything in the room that was not Camilla's face. "Was she attended?" Camilla asked. Her voice was exactly the right register, steady, appropriate. "Yes, ma'am. Guard Aldwych stayed with her." A beat. "Until she was ready to retire," Mrs. Lyle added. Camilla picked the paper back up. She read the same sentence 4 times without comprehending it. Guard Aldwych. Thomas Aldwych, who had been with the household since before she'd arrived in it, who moved through its corridors like part of the building itself, who had, apparently, sat on the floor of the East sitting room with her stepdaughter until her stepdaughter was ready to go to bed, while Camilla had walked past the light under the door. She turned the page. The paper's headline was something about Parliament. She read it twice and retained nothing. Too loud. An accurate observation. A mild correction. The sort of thing that was forgotten in a week. She had walked past the light under the door. The fruit plate sat in front of her, arranged exactly as she preferred it. The coffee was the correct temperature, and the morning was proceeding with its customary precision. Everything in the room was right. She set the paper down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely reliable. Outside the window, far across the gray grounds, she could just make out the shape of a rider on the path that ran along the east garden wall, yellow hair, even at this distance. Moving at a canter, not a gallop, controlled, deliberate, a girl who knew how to hold something in without letting it run away with her. Camilla watched until the rider disappeared behind the line of trees. She did not pick the paper back up. The photograph appeared 3 days later. Not a paparazzi shot. Nothing dramatic. A single frame from the Commonwealth Reception's official documentation. The photographer had been working the room from the far end. By capturing ambient footage, the kind that ends up in archive folders and is never meant to be published. Someone had pulled it and sent it to a contact. It ran in 2 outlets by Thursday morning. In it, Charlotte was mid-laugh, her head tipped back, hands animated, talking to an older man in a dark suit who was leaning in with the genuine attention of a person who is actually interested in what he is hearing. They were both holding small plates. The Kenyan High Commissioner had one hand raised, illustrating something. Charlotte's face was open. That was the word. Open the way children's faces are before the world teaches them to manage the aperture. The caption on the first outlet read, "Princess Charlotte charms Commonwealth diplomats with conservation conversation." The second outlet ran a slightly longer piece. It noted that the High Commissioner had spoken warmly of the princess in a brief statement to Kenyan press. It noted that his youngest daughter, aged 9, had apparently been mentioned. It quoted him as saying that Charlotte was already a natural diplomat, the kind who listens before she speaks. The piece ran under the headline, "The Princess Who Paid Attention." Camilla read both pieces. She read them in the Cornwall suite, alone, at the writing desk where the pen sat in the same place she'd left it 3 nights ago. She was a woman who had survived the unsurvivable. She knew how narratives moved. She knew the difference between a story that was building and a story that was arriving, and this one, The Princess Who Paid Attention, was not building. It had already arrived. She folded the printouts in half and set them face down on the desk. The thing about a plan is that it requires a problem, a real one, a genuine gap or liability in the image that needs managing. If the thing you'd moved to correct turned out not to be a liability at all, then the correction itself became the event, became the story. Or would, if anyone connected the dots, and someone always connected the dots. Camilla was very good at this. It was her particular fluency, reading the architecture of a narrative before it settled. She had used this skill for 20 years to protect and position and manage, and she was using it now, turned inward on herself, and what it showed her was not comfortable. Too loud, an accurate observation. The High Commissioner had called her the kind who listens before she speaks. Camilla put her hands flat on the writing desk. She was not a cruel woman. She needed this. She had always needed this, the way you need the foundation to hold. She was a woman who had come through fire and built something from the other side of it, and the building of it had required a precision that sometimes looked, from certain angles, like coldness. She knew this. She'd made her peace with it. She had walked past the light under the door. A palace guard, a man paid to stand at walls and see nothing, had sat on the floor with her stepdaughter for 22 minutes. The pen was on the desk where she'd left it. She picked it up, set it back down. She went to Charlotte on Friday afternoon, not with a plan. And this was important and unprecedented, and she was aware of both. She walked down the corridor to the door of Charlotte's sitting room, the small one on the second floor, the one with the window seat where the girl spent most of her voluntary hours, and she knocked. A pause. "Come in." Charlotte was on the window seat. Books spread around her, the ones about animals, about ecosystems, about the various ways the world sustained itself when humans left it alone. She looked up with a face that arranged itself quickly into a neutral expression, the one that was learning already to hold its aperture managed. Camilla sat in the chair nearest the window. Not the settee by the door, the near chair, the one that required her to cross the room. "I saw the piece about the reception," she said. About the High Commissioner." Charlotte said nothing. Her hand rested on an open book. One of the illustrations showed a bird Camilla didn't recognize, something coastal, long-legged, the kind that stands very still and watches the water. "You were right," Camilla said. The words cost something. She was aware of the cost with the precision of a woman who had balanced long ledgers. This particular currency she did not spend freely. Had not spent freely, perhaps, in longer than she wished to calculate. Charlotte's hand on the book didn't move. I was managing an image, Camilla continued, rather than attending to the actual moment. A pause. That was a mistake, the kind I should know better than to make. She did not say I'm sorry the way it was usually said, quickly, preceding or following some reframe that softened the premise of the apology until the apology itself had been apologized for. She said what she said, and then she stopped. The bird in the illustration was still standing in the water. His youngest is learning bird calls, Charlotte said. Quiet. Not forgiving, not yet. There were things that didn't resolve in a single afternoon, but present. Attending. He told me, Charlotte continued. The High Commissioner. He said she can identify 11 species by ear. A pause. I told him about the peregrine falcons at Balmoral. He wants to bring her sometime. Camilla looked at her stepdaughter, 11 years old. William's eyes. A laugh too loud by someone else's accounting, and a conversation that had produced a diplomatic warmth no briefing document could have manufactured. She's sitting in a window seat with her books and her birds, and the careful face that was still learning, still deciding, still figuring out how much of itself to keep. The peregrines nest on the north wall, Camilla said. I can show you where they're most visible in the morning if you wanted to know for when he visits. Charlotte looked at her. Not with forgiveness. Not with the erasure of the yellow dress and the delegates and the thing that still sat open and unresolved in both of them, but with something, a door left ajar rather than shut, the aperture not closed. Okay, Charlotte said, one word, small, the size of a first step. Thomas Aldwick finished his Friday round at 22:09. The long corridor was empty, the way it always was. The portraits watched him with their painted patience. The floors were polished, the sconces lit, everything in its correct and ordered place. He paused at the door of the east sitting room. The light was off. No sound from inside. He noted this the way he noted all things, quietly without ceremony, and walked on. His daughter called on Sundays. He would answer this Sunday the way he always did, and they would talk about Bristol and her work and the small, ordinary details of a life proceeding in the right direction, and he would not tell her this story because it wasn't his to tell. But he would think, he knew, for a very long time about an 11-year-old girl sitting on a floor in a yellow dress, and about the specific weight of a head that trusts you enough to lean for one unguarded second against your shoulder, and about what it costs to be the person in the corridor who keeps walking, and the kind who doesn't. And the clock ticked. The corridor held him and let him go. He finished his rounds on time. End.